March 7, 1945. The Rhine River, a gray serpent twisting through the heart of Germany, glimmers beneath a cold, low sky. The air smells of oil, cordite, and rain. German artillery echoes from the far bank, its thunder rolling like distant storms. Smoke drifts above the shattered town of Remagen, where the Ludendorff Bridge still stands, scarred, trembling, and impossible. On the western shore, American soldiers press forward, helmets glinting through the haze. Combat engineers, their faces streaked with mud and fear, haul steel plates, cables, and lumber through the chaos. They move with a precision that borders on disbelief, shouting orders over the whistle of incoming shells. The bridge groans, struck again and again, yet remains upright, as if defying the war itself. Across the river, German commanders stare through their binoculars, stunned. They had destroyed every crossing along the Rhine, certain the Americans would be stopped here for weeks. Yet now, before their eyes, the impossible unfolds. U.S. troops pouring across a bridge they were sure would never stand. They radio Berlin in disbelief. The Americans are already on the East Bank. The impossible crossing has begun. By the beginning of 1945, the Second World War in Europe had reached a critical, almost surreal phase. The German army was retreating on nearly every front, but it was retreating with a grim purpose, destroying everything it left behind. Bridges, railways, factories, even small village crossings were blown to fragments. The Rhine River, long regarded as the natural spine of Germany, became their last great line of defense. Behind it lay the industrial heartland, the Ruhr, and the hope that perhaps, if they could slow the Allies long enough, negotiations or miracles might still save them. The Allies, meanwhile, were moving like a relentless tide. After the bloody but decisive breakout from Normandy, the U.S. 1st, 3rd, and 9th Armies swept through France and into Belgium, their armored divisions covering miles each day. But as winter deepened and the Battle of the Bulge erupted in the Ardennes, momentum faltered. Bridges that had once carried fuel, food, and ammunition were gone. Riverbanks that should have meant progress now marked stagnation. Among the Allied ranks, one group began to rise from quiet anonymity. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. They were not glamorous. They didn't lead charges or storm cities. They built, and because they built, others could move. Their mission was simple, yet brutally demanding: to keep the Allied advance alive, no matter what the terrain or enemy destroyed. The engineers worked like ghosts behind the front. In the ruins of France and Belgium, they repaired roads cratered by bombs and constructed temporary bridges across rivers that no longer had names, only numbers and coordinates. Each time the Germans destroyed a bridge, the Americans built a new one, often within hours. By late 1944, American ingenuity in bridging had evolved into something extraordinary. Prefabricated metal trusses known as Bailey bridges became the backbone of mobility. These modular sections could be assembled by hand, without cranes, even under fire. In some cases, tanks rolled across a completed bridge less than a day after the first steel panel had been unpacked. To the Germans, who relied heavily on deliberate, time-consuming engineering methods, this was unthinkable. Still, rivers like the Moselle and the Saar tested even the best of American improvisation. Ice, strong currents, and heavy resistance made each crossing a nightmare. Engineers labored knee-deep in freezing water, under artillery fire, using pontoon boats, timber, and anything that would float. They learned to anchor cables to trees and wrecks, to build by night, and to repair under attack. In December 1944, as Hitler launched his last offensive in the Ardennes, the Allies realized just how essential these men were. When supply lines broke and bridges collapsed under German counterattacks, Engineers built alternate crossings that saved entire divisions from being trapped. Without them, Patton's Third Army would have been immobilized in the snow. By early 1945, the U.S. High Command understood one fact above all. To end the war, they would need to cross the Rhine. Every mile of German territory west of it was being methodically cleared, but the river itself was a natural fortress, broad, fast, and fiercely defended. Its high banks offered perfect artillery positions. Every bridge spanning it had been pre-wired with explosives or already reduced to rubble. The task now was monumental. Eisenhower's orders were clear. The Allies must cross the Rhine before the Germans could regroup. The American engineers began preparing months in advance, stockpiling Bailey Bridge components, pontoons, and cranes. Special bridge trains were organized to carry materials forward as fast as infantry and armor advanced. Entire units rehearsed crossings on mock rivers behind the front lines. For the Germans, watching from across the water, the destruction of the Rhine bridges was both a tactical necessity and a symbol of defiance. Hitler himself had ordered them blown to slow the Allied momentum. Towns like Wesel, Cologne, and Koblenz saw their massive spans collapse into the river, turning engineering triumphs into twisted wrecks of iron. Yet, in destroying their own crossings, the Germans underestimated one thing: the American ability to rebuild faster than destruction could keep up. Wherever the Wehrmacht blew up a bridge, the U.S. engineers arrived with steel and determination. What began as necessity soon became legend. A race between demolition and reconstruction, between fire and resolve. And in this race, the Americans were winning. From the muddy fields of France to the frozen rivers of the Ardennes, the pattern repeated. Explosions one night, a new bridge by dawn. The German High Command dismissed the reports at first, but as the front closed in on the Rhine, disbelief began turning to alarm. Their last defensive line was being approached by an army that refused to stop for broken terrain. The stage was set for the final confrontation, where speed, innovation, and courage would collide with desperation. The river that divided empires was about to witness history's most impossible crossing. To understand how the Americans managed the impossible at the Rhine, one must look not just at their courage, but at the machinery of thought and organization behind it. The United States Army had turned engineering into an art of war, and its engineers into instruments of momentum. By 1945, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers had nearly 500,000 personnel operating in the European theater. These men were divided into specialized battalions: combat engineers, pontoon units, maintenance companies, and topographic surveyors. They moved in rhythm with the fighting divisions, bridging every obstacle that nature or the enemy could throw in their way. Every movement of tanks, trucks, and artillery across Europe was supported by an invisible network of builders who never stopped working. The heart of this success was mobility doctrine, a principle drilled into American command culture from North Africa to Normandy. U.S. strategy depended on movement, striking fast, bypassing strong points, and overwhelming the enemy before he could react. Engineers were the bloodstream of this strategy. Without bridges, there was no momentum. Without momentum, there was no victory. British and Canadian forces were masters of precision and planning, but the Americans brought something different: improvisation. They could turn a wrecked barge into a ferry, a collapsed bridge into a causeway, or a destroyed town into a logistics hub overnight. This flexibility bewildered the German command, which relied on meticulous coordination and centralized orders. Where German officers saw chaos, the Americans saw opportunity. Technologically, the Americans had refined the Bailey Bridge system, originally developed by the British, into a mass-production miracle. Its prefabricated steel panels could be carried by trucks and assembled by hand. No rivets, no welding, just pins, jacks, and teamwork. A 200-foot bridge could be built in hours if the men worked without pause. The U.S. engineers became masters of this modular design, often combining it with pontoons to create floating bridges capable of carrying tanks. Then there were the treadway bridges, floating platforms that unrolled across rivers like metallic carpets. These could support Sherman tanks, supply convoys, even entire armored columns. At the height of the campaign, American engineers built more than 2,500 bridges in Europe, averaging one new bridge every 5 miles of advance. The logistical preparation was astonishing. Engineers carried blueprints for every major river crossing in Western Europe long before they arrived there. They knew the flow rate of the Rhine, the strength of its currents, the width of its channels, and the soil composition of its banks. The U.S. Army had turned geography itself into intelligence. Yet, numbers and technology tell only part of the story. The real miracle was endurance. Engineers often worked for 48 hours straight, under enemy fire, with little sleep or food. They built by torchlight, guided by tracers and the flashes of artillery. Many bridges were constructed, while German snipers picked off workers from across the water. In some cases, the engineers laid smoke screens to conceal their movements, even as they coughed through the choking haze. The German High Command could not comprehend how these men sustained their pace. Field reports from the Wehrmacht's western divisions describe their disbelief in detail. "They work like ants," one officer wrote. "We destroy a bridge at dusk. By morning, it is rebuilt." By morning, it is rebuilt. To the German eye, American warfare seemed mechanical, relentless, an assembly line of destruction and reconstruction. Yet, behind that machine were human beings, exhausted and afraid, driven by an understanding that every plank they placed brought the war closer to its end. The crossing of the Rhine was not supposed to be easy. In the eyes of German planners, it was to be the ultimate barrier, the river that would buy time for regrouping, for a final stand. But the American engineers had other ideas. They did not wait for orders to act. They prepared for every possible scenario. Portable pontoons, mobile cranes, heavy bridging trucks, all were positioned within hours of the advancing infantry. In March 1945, as the U.S. First Army approached Remagen, the Germans detonated nearly every bridge along the river. Each explosion lit up the sky like a pyre. Each seemed to proclaim, "You will not cross here." Yet, fate had left one bridge standing, the Ludendorff. When American patrols saw it still intact, they could scarcely believe their eyes. The opportunity was so unexpected, so fragile that every minute mattered. And when the engineers moved in to secure and reinforce it, the world witnessed a moment that changed the war's tempo forever. What followed was not only a feat of military engineering, but a demonstration of willpower that shattered German confidence. For the first time in history, American forces would cross the mighty Rhine, not by waiting, but by building faster than their enemies could destroy. When historians recount the Rhine crossing, they often speak of the moment the first American soldiers stepped onto the eastern bank. But beneath that image lies a web of interlocking stories: human, tactical, technological, and psychological, each revealing how the impossible became real. The human angle for the combat engineers, the Rhine was not just a river. It was an adversary of its own, vast, unpredictable, and merciless. They worked knee-deep in freezing water, often without knowing whether the structure they were building would survive another hour. Every hammer strike echoed through fog and smoke, drawing enemy fire. They did not have the glory of the infantry or the prestige of the airmen, yet their courage was the backbone of every advance. Eyewitness reports describe engineers carrying timbers and steel plates across open ground, shells bursting around them. When pontoon sections were hit, they dragged replacements through mud, sometimes swimming the final meters to secure lines. Commanders later wrote that some men refused to leave their posts even when wounded. They tied themselves to cables to keep working. In their quiet defiance lay a truth that few could put into words. Wars are not only fought by those who destroy, but by those who build under fire. The tactical angle, the crossing at Remagen, was not luck. It was a calculated readiness, the result of months of training and doctrine shaped by hard experience. American field commanders understood that every delay at a river cost lives. The faster they could establish a bridgehead, the fewer soldiers would die. Speed became strategy. Patton had famously said that he wanted his engineers to think like attackers, not laborers. That mindset had spread across all fronts by 1945. Engineer battalions were embedded directly with infantry and armor units, moving with them as part of the assault wave. This meant that the moment the enemy fell back, bridge construction could begin, sometimes before the last shots were fired. At Remagen, when the Americans discovered the Ludendorff Bridge intact, they did not hesitate. Within minutes, infantry dashed across, securing both ends while engineers raced forward with reinforcements. Instead of waiting for orders or clearance, they acted, their initiative saving hours that might have cost hundreds of lives. In that sense, the U.S. Army's greatest tactical advantage was not technology, but trust. Junior officers empowered to make decisions in the heat of battle. The technological angle, the success at the Rhine, was the culmination of a quiet revolution in military engineering. American bridging technology had evolved beyond anything seen before. The M2 Treadway Bridge, a floating platform made of steel pontoons connected by metal tracks, could be deployed in a matter of hours. It carried tanks weighing over 30 tons and could stretch across rivers more than 1,000 feet wide. Then there were the Bailey Bridges, named after British engineer Donald Bailey, but perfected by the Americans for field use. Each bridge was built from modular panels, hand-carried to the site, and assembled like a massive Meccano set. Teams of 50 men could construct a 200-foot span in less than a day. During the Rhine campaign, American engineers sometimes completed entire bridges under artillery fire without losing a single section. The Germans, for all their engineering prowess, were caught off guard by this efficiency. Their own bridging methods, while technically sophisticated, relied on complex machinery and centralized logistics. American systems, by contrast, were decentralized. Each unit carried its own materials, and every man knew his part. The result was a kind of mechanical choreography that looked chaotic, but moved with breathtaking precision. The psychological angle for the German command, watching the Americans bridge rivers with such speed, was more than a tactical concern. It was a psychological blow. Reports from Wehrmacht officers reveal their growing despair. One officer from Army Group B wrote, "The enemy's bridges rise from the water faster than we can destroy them. It is as if the river itself fights for them." This sense of futility spread quickly. German demolition teams, once confident in their ability to delay the Allied advance, now faced an opponent who rebuilt faster than they could retreat. Every explosion that tore down a bridge was answered by the clang of new steel rising behind it. The Germans had prepared for a slow war of attrition. Instead, they faced a storm of motion. Even ordinary German soldiers felt it. Prisoners captured after the Remagen crossing spoke of disbelief, of feeling hunted not just by American tanks, but by American ingenuity. The sight of engineers working under fire, seemingly indifferent to danger, broke the illusion of control. The war, once fought on terms of destruction, had become a contest of endurance and creation, and Germany was losing. The leadership angle behind the daring on the ground was leadership that refused to micromanage. Generals Eisenhower, Bradley, and Hodges understood that bridging operations demanded speed above all else. They trusted their field engineers completely. Patton, in his blunt way, often reminded his subordinates that engineers were the soul of the advance. This leadership philosophy extended downward. Company commanders gave their men autonomy to improvise. If a section of bridge was destroyed, the nearest sergeant didn't wait for new orders. He rebuilt it. The American chain of command was elastic, and that elasticity was its strength. Leadership also showed in morale. While German officers barked orders and demanded impossible results, American commanders often stood shoulder to shoulder with their engineers, sharing danger and exhaustion. In memoirs written years later, veterans recalled seeing generals walking among the bridge crews, shouting encouragement over the noise of hammering and gunfire. It gave the men a sense that what they were building was not just a bridge, but a symbol, a path home. Each of these angles, human, tactical, technological, psychological, and leadership, converged in a single truth. The Americans had transformed war itself. They fought not just with weapons, but with ideas, discipline, and relentless adaptability. And as dawn rose over the Rhine, those ideas would be tested in the crucible of the Ludendorff Bridge, where history paused and disbelief turned to panic on the German side of the river. The next morning, the corridors of CNN felt colder. Staff members whispered in corners. Phones buzzed with messages they dared not open. John Kennedy had arrived early, his suit perfectly pressed, his jaw clenched. He had been humiliated. And in Washington, humiliation is blood in the water. By 9 a.m., Rachel Maddow's phone began lighting up. Producers, editors, allies, all warning her of what was coming. A senior anchor, once her mentor, had gone on air to call her reckless. A leaked memo suggested CNN was considering disciplinary measures. It was clear. Someone powerful wanted her silenced, but Rachel was not built to kneel. When she entered the studio that evening, her team saw a fire in her eyes they hadn't seen before. The teleprompter showed the pre-approved script. Diplomatic, careful, sanitized. She glanced at it, and then looked away. "Good evening," she began, her voice steady but charged. "Tonight I was asked to read something safe, something neutral, but I believe you deserve the truth. Not the version that comforts power." The control room froze. The producers exchanged panicked looks, but Rachel continued. "When I asked Senator Kennedy the questions I did, it wasn't personal. It was patriotic. Accountability is not an attack. It is the duty of journalism. If telling the truth makes the powerful uncomfortable, then perhaps it's not the truth that should change, but the power itself." For a moment, there was silence. Then social media exploded. Hashtags with her name trended across platforms. Millions shared clips of her defiance. In a dimly lit office across town, John Kennedy watched the broadcast replay, his hand tightening around his glass of bourbon. "She just declared war," he muttered. Rachel, meanwhile, leaned back in her chair after the cameras went dark. She exhaled, exhausted but unbroken. She had just risked everything: her job, her reputation, her safety. Within hours of Rachel's unscripted monologue, the media world erupted. Her name flooded timelines and headlines. Some hailed her as a truth-teller, a journalist with courage rare in the modern age. Others branded her unstable, unprofessional, and dangerous. The network executives convened an emergency meeting in a glass-walled boardroom overlooking the city. An irony not lost on Rachel, who was now the subject of their whispered deliberations. The men in suits discussed her like a liability, a brand risk to be contained. One of them, a silver-haired executive with the smooth calm of corporate diplomacy, said, "She's too emotional. It's time we consider suspension." The word suspension echoed like thunder in the hallways. Inside her dressing room, Rachel sat alone, scrolling through messages. Thousands of them. A single one caught her attention. "You reminded me what journalism used to be. Don't stop." Anonymous, her heart steadied. She smiled faintly, though the walls around her felt tighter with every second. By evening, the press had its story. Maddow faces internal probe after fiery broadcast. The clip of her speech, where she declared truth above power, was replayed, dissected, and weaponized. Every network had an opinion. Every pundit had a theory. Meanwhile, John Kennedy appeared on Fox News, his voice dripping with contempt. This is what happens when so-called journalists forget their place. They're not truth-tellers. They're entertainers with delusions of grandeur. He smirked as the host nodded in agreement. The audience laughed. But what Kennedy didn't know was that his mockery only fueled the storm. Viewers who'd never watched Rachel before were now searching her name. Her audience was growing by the minute. Back at CNN, a producer knocked gently on her door. "They want you in the executive conference room," he said quietly. Rachel took a deep breath, straightened her blazer, and stood. She knew what was coming. The ambush, the corporate script, the veiled threats. But she also knew one thing more. She had crossed a line that no power could force her back from. Truth, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. The elevator doors opened to a wall of silence. Every executive she passed avoided eye contact, as if truth itself had become contagious. Rachel's heels echoed on the marble floor, each step carrying her closer to the reckoning she already anticipated. Inside the conference room, the lights were cold, clinical. A dozen faces turned toward her: the network president, legal advisors, PR handlers. In the center of the long oak table sat a folder with her name printed in sharp black letters. The president leaned back in his chair. "Rachel," he began smoothly, "you put the network in a difficult position." She didn't answer. Another executive, younger and visibly nervous, added, "Your outburst last night. It's being interpreted as political activism, not journalism. We need to manage optics." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "Optics?" she repeated. "You're worried about optics when a sitting senator just admitted on national television that corporations control legislation?" The room tensed. Someone cleared his throat. "We're asking for a temporary leave. Voluntary, of course, just until things settle down." "Voluntary?" she asked. "Or strategic exile?" No one responded. The silence spoke louder than any words. Rachel stood slowly, resting both hands on the table. "You brought me here to silence me. You're protecting your relationships with the same people I exposed. But let me make something clear. You can take away my time slot, my show, even my paycheck. But you cannot take back what millions already heard." Her voice sharpened. "Truth doesn't need a broadcast license." The president exhaled, pinching his nose. "Rachel, think carefully. We can destroy your reputation." She smiled, not in defiance, but in understanding. "You already did," she said quietly. "And somehow it set me free." With that, she turned toward the door. The walls seemed smaller, the air heavier, but her chest lighter. Behind her, the executives exchanged anxious whispers, already drafting their official statement. Outside, cameras waited. The city buzzed. Rachel Maddow walked out of the network building not as an anchor, but as something far more dangerous. A woman who had nothing left to lose. By morning, the story had broken everywhere. Clips of Rachel's confrontation with Senator Kennedy flooded every social feed, every platform, every screen. The algorithms couldn't contain it. The video spread like a pulse. Millions of shares, millions of views, each one carrying the same haunting question: who really controls democracy? Cable networks tried to suppress it, scrubbing mentions, muting hashtags, redirecting searches. But the internet had already taken hold. Independent journalists uploaded the footage, students dissected it in dorm rooms, and veterans of past political scandals called it the interview that cracked the illusion. And yet, inside the Capitol, a different storm brewed. Kennedy's team launched a coordinated damage control effort. Leaked memos instructed staff to reframe the narrative, painting Rachel as emotional, biased, and unstable. Anonymous op-eds questioned her integrity, hinting at partisan motives. The strategy was as old as power itself. Discredit the messenger, bury the message. But this time, it failed. Americans had seen the exchange unfiltered. They watched a senator smirk when pressed about corporate influence. They watched him stumble when the truth left no escape. They watched him invoke patriotism like a shield, and they saw through it. Public trust began to fracture. Not because of one interview, but because the interview exposed something people had long suspected. The system no longer served them. In small towns and sprawling cities, conversations shifted. Construction workers debated policy at lunch. Teachers discussed lobbying in classrooms. Even veterans who once dismissed political talk as just noise began asking questions. Meanwhile, in private, Rachel retreated from the chaos. Her apartment became a quiet sanctuary. Stacks of books, piles of notes, flickering candlelight reflected in her glasses. She replayed the footage, not with pride, but with an aching clarity. She knew what she had done was irreversible, not just for her career, but for the perception of truth itself. She had torn the mask off live television, and beneath it lay a wound the nation could finally see. Calls poured in. Whistleblowers, former aides, analysts, each one wanting to share what they had been too afraid to reveal before. Rachel filled notebook after notebook, cross-referencing names, timelines, companies. The deeper she went, the clearer the pattern became. Money was not the byproduct of politics. It was its bloodstream. And yet, something else stirred beneath the outrage. Hope. Viewers began crowdfunding independent news collectives. Journalists left corporate media to start grassroots channels. The idea that truth could exist without sponsors took root. Weeks later, Rachel appeared again, not behind a studio desk, but in a modest room, live streaming from a camera she set up herself. No lights, no teleprompter, just her voice. "Tonight," she began, "we start again. No scripts, no filters, just the truth, however uncomfortable it might be." The stream crashed within minutes, overloaded by viewers. Senator Kennedy, meanwhile, avoided interviews. His approval ratings dipped. In committee hearings, he grew sharper, colder, more defensive. But whispers spread that he feared another encounter. Not with a journalist, but with accountability itself. History would later record this as a cultural shift, a moment when one voice fractured the illusion of neutrality and reminded millions that democracy's most dangerous enemy is not opposition. It is silence. And for Rachel Maddow, the silence had finally ended. Her story wasn't about winning or losing. It was about endurance, about standing firm when every system around you demands submission. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the night sky. The world kept turning, politics kept spinning. But somewhere deep beneath the noise, something fundamental had changed. People were listening again. History would remember it, not for its spectacle, but for its silence. The seconds when Kennedy had no answer, when his smirk faltered, and the weight of unspoken truths hung in the air. It was in that pause that millions realized how fragile power truly is when faced with unfiltered honesty. The interview became more than an event. It became a mirror. It reflected the growing fracture between the governed and those who govern. It reminded a weary nation that democracy is not defended by the loudest voice, but by the bravest question. Long after the headlines faded, its echoes remained. Students cited it in classrooms. Activists replayed it before rallies. Journalists whispered about it in newsrooms, wondering when they, too, might find the courage to stop reading from the script. And perhaps that was its truest victory. Not in the fall of a senator or the rise of a journalist, but in the rekindling of a collective awareness, a reminder that truth, once spoken with conviction, cannot be silenced again. The lights of Washington still burn late into the night. Endless meetings, endless spin, but somewhere, in the hum of servers and the quiet of home screens, that clip continues to play. A senator caught off guard, a journalist unflinching, a moment when truth refused to wait its turn. Because history is not written by those who hold power. It is written by those who dare to challenge it. And that night, Rachel Maddow did exactly that.